This is a story about one of the greatest strategic blunders in all of history. We're talking about a single decision so catastrophic it cost an empire what would be, in today's money, well over $1 trillion. And this isn't just some dusty old story, it is a masterclass in how logistics, geography, and one single, terrible choice can bring a superpower that seems completely invincible to its knees.
So how does that even happen, right? How does the most advanced, the wealthiest state of its time, a superpower that for all intents and purposes looked absolutely unbeatable, end up engineering its own downfall? Well, it wasn't some single epic battle. No, it was something way more subtle, like a slow-acting poison administered by one decision that would unravel everything. So let's start with the engine of their power.
You see, the State of Wei had built the world's most sophisticated political and military machine. They had the best army, the most advanced bureaucracy, the whole thing was humming along perfectly. But, even the most powerful engine is just a hunk of metal without fuel. And back in the 4th century BC, that fuel wasn't oil. The fuel of this ancient empire came down to 3 absolutely critical resources: salt, iron, and millet. See, Wei didn't just have more land than its rivals, it had the right land. They basically controlled a near monopoly on the 3 things that would decide who dominated the entire Warring States era. Let's break down why each one of these was such a massive game changer. We're going to start with the most basic, but you could argue the most important resource of all: food. And specifically, a grain you probably don't think much about today, but one that was the absolute king of the ancient battlefields. Now, you might be thinking, wait, why millet? What about other stuff, like beans or wheat? They've got more protein, right? And that's a great question. The answer, though, lies in the gritty reality of a military campaign. The sources tell us that for an army on the move, beans were downright dangerous. Why? Because you can't cook them properly over a campfire, not without a modern pressure cooker. And what happens when a bunch of soldiers eat half-cooked beans? Well, to put it bluntly, you get a diarrhea epidemic that could cripple an army way faster than any enemy could. Millet, on the other hand, easy to cook, easy to digest. It was the perfect military superfood. But here is the real kicker, the number that changed absolutely everything: 9 years. That is how long millet could be stored. Rice, for comparison, goes bad after 5. Now, this wasn't just some small advantage. This was a total game changer. It meant Wei could stockpile enough grain to get through decade-long droughts, sieges, or massive wars. They had a logistical stamina their rivals could only dream of. So, just to recap, millet gave Wei this incredible strategic edge. First, that 9-year shelf life meant they could build up these huge reserves. Second, those reserves gave them the stamina to fight long wars that would bankrupt anybody else. Third, since it was their staple crop, it had a super low tax cost. It was easy for the state to collect and store. And finally, their territory was just perfectly suited for growing it. This wasn't just food, it was the bedrock of their entire military dominance. Okay, so Wei could outlast anyone in a long fight. But wars aren't just fought with grain, they are funded by wealth. And as it turns out, Wei also happened to control the 2 most valuable industrial commodities of the ancient world: salt and iron. Just think of salt as the oil of the ancient world. Seriously, in an era with zero refrigeration, salt was the one and only cold chain technology that existed. It was the only way you could preserve meat, fish, vegetables, anything for long-distance trade, or, even more importantly, for feeding an army on a long campaign. You control the salt, you control the flow of all preserved food. Period. But here's where the real genius of Wei's strategy comes in. It wasn't just controlling the salt. It was how they used that control to fund the state. Salt became their ultimate stealth tax. It was a way to generate massive, massive revenue without anyone in the population ever really feeling like they were being taxed. And here's how it worked, and it was absolutely brilliant. Instead of sending out thousands of tax collectors to individual homes, which is super expensive and just breeds corruption, you just control the source. Wei controlled the salt pools. They taxed the salt right there at the mine. That slightly higher price was then just passed down the supply chain. And since every single person needed salt to live, the entire population paid this tax without even thinking about it. It was a perfect system. You combine that with their control of iron, the high-tech industry of the day, and Wei was, without a doubt, the economic superpower. So Wei has food security, they have unbelievable wealth, but they had one more advantage, an unfair advantage that was literally written into the landscape itself. We're talking about geography and the brutal physics of ancient warfare. Let's do a little thought experiment, okay? You're a general. You've got to move an army of 100,000 soldiers across 1,000 miles of hostile land. How do you feed them? How many people do you need just to carry the food? Go on, take a guess. I promise you, the number is going to shock you. 3.5 million. You heard that right. You need 3.5 million porters. That's a ratio of 35 porters for every single soldier on the front line. Now, why? It's the terrible, inescapable logic of ancient logistics. The porters eat the cargo they carry. By the time a supply caravan actually reaches the front, the porters and their animals have eaten almost everything they started with. This is the fundamental problem that made long-distance invasions almost impossible. And this is exactly where Wei's geography becomes a weapon. They controlled the Hangu Pass, which was basically the throat of ancient China. And what's really wild about this is just the sheer mathematical brutality of it. To defend that pass, you might need, say, 10,000 soldiers. Their logistical cost is basically zero. They're supplied by local farms. But to attack that pass, you need 100,000 soldiers, and your logistical cost is 20 times higher. This pass literally trapped the rival state of Qin in a geographic cage. So, with their food reserves, their salt and iron wealth, and their absolute geographic dominance, Wei wasn't just another powerful state. No, they were the gatekeeper. They held all the cards. They seemed utterly invincible. And this is where the story takes a tragic turn. With all this incredible power, the leaders of Wei stood at a crossroads. They faced a strategic choice that would determine not just their own future, but the future of all of China. The fate of an entire empire rested on this one decision. They had two options. To the west, they could fight the Hard War, a difficult, grinding campaign in the mountains to finally crush the rival state of Qing and secure their borders forever. Or they could go east and fight the Easy War, a very tempting campaign to gobble up the rich, fertile, and completely undefended lands of the Central Plains. It was a choice between ultimate, long-term security and immediate, glorious conquest. Wei chose the easy path. They turned their backs on the difficult war in the west and marched east toward the promise of quick, effortless victory. And this choice, this decision to go for the easy, fertile plains of the east, would become known as the toxic honey. It looked sweet, it tasted sweet, but it was laced with a slow-acting poison that would rot the state from the inside out. And here's exactly why it was so toxic. The Central Plains were rich, sure, but they were geographically indefensible. There were no mountains, no major rivers to act as natural barriers. So every new piece of land that Wei conquered put them in direct conflict with another major power. They had willingly and foolishly walked right into a forefront war. And the fallout was catastrophic. Wei's elite army, the famous Wuzhou soldiers, were just bled dry in endless, pointless wars. All that massive wealth from salt and iron was squandered trying to defend land that simply couldn't be held. And all the while, that back door to the west, it was left wide open, allowing the caged state of Qin to grow, to reform, and to sharpen its teeth, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By the time the next king took the throne, the situation was absolutely dire. The state was completely exhausted from this forefront war, and a bitter personal grudge between two of the most brilliant military strategists the world has ever known was about to just erupt, setting the entire stage for a new, even bloodier chapter of this incredible story. So that brings us to the big question, and I want to hear from you on this. Put yourself in the King of Wei's position. With all of that power at your fingertips, what would you have done? Would you have chosen the hard war in the West for permanent security? Or would you have been tempted by the toxic honey of the East? Let me know what your strategy would be down in the comments. And if you want to see the epic showdown that this blunder sets up, make sure to like and subscribe. Trust me, you are not going to want to miss what happens next.